The hall was full of laughter that evening. Wealthy guests in shiny clothes filled the long room of the old orphanage, clinking their glasses as they spoke about business, money, and their next vacations. It was one of those charity events that people attended just to be seen as kind. At the center table sat a man who always drew attention, a millionaire known for his confidence and pride. Everything about him spoke of power. The way he spoke, the way he carried his coat over his shoulder, even the way others looked at him with quiet respect. He didn't really care about the charity. For him, it was just another social gathering, another opportunity to show his influence. The orphanage director had invited him hoping he would donate to help the children, maybe buy them some instruments or books. But the man didn't believe in such things. He thought that people made their own luck and those who didn't were simply weak. When he walked around the hall, people tried to impress him with stories about the orphanage children, their small talents, their innocent smiles. But he only listened halfway. He smiled politely, said a few words, and turned away. He didn't notice the small girl sitting near the piano in the corner. She was about 12, dressed in a plain blue dress with her hair tied back neatly. Her eyes followed the keys of the piano like she was dreaming about something. The piano itself looked almost broken. The paint was chipped, a few keys were missing, and it leaned slightly to one side. It had probably been there for decades. But the girl didn't seem to see the damage. To her, it was something special. When one of the guests mentioned to the millionaire that the girl loved playing, he laughed lightly and said, "Oh, really? On that thing? I doubt it even works." The guest smiled awkwardly. "She tries, sir. She practices every day. They say she can play beautifully." The man leaned back in his chair and smirked. He wasn't cruel, just careless. He wanted to amuse himself, to show off his sense of humor. "All right," he said loudly, his voice carrying through the room. "If she plays the piano, I'll adopt her." The words hung in the air like a strange echo. A few people laughed, thinking it was a joke. The girl looked up confused, her small hands frozen on her lap. The orphanage director quickly tried to change the subject, but the millionaire's challenge had already caught everyone's attention. He looked around the table, smiling. "Come now, it's just for fun," he said. "Let's see what kind of talent we have here." The girl stood slowly. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. She didn't look scared, just surprised. She looked at the old piano and then back at the man. Maybe she didn't fully understand his tone. Maybe she believed he meant what he said. Either way, she quietly walked toward the piano. The room fell silent. Even those who had been laughing a moment before now turned their heads, curious to see what would happen. The millionaire raised an eyebrow. He thought she might cry or refuse. But she didn't. She reached out, wiped the dust from the keys, and sat down gently. The stool creaked beneath her, and her small feet barely touched the floor. She placed her fingers on the keys like she was touching something sacred. For a moment, nothing happened. The air felt heavy. The children in the corner watched her with hope, whispering softly to each other. The adults waited for something to laugh about. Then, very quietly, she pressed the first key. It made a dull sound, out of tune and broken. Someone at the back chuckled. She didn't look up. She pressed another key and then another. Some worked, some didn't. She tried a few more, searching for notes that still sounded right. Her fingers moved slowly, testing, listening, feeling. The millionaire leaned back, half amused, half bored. He had already decided the show was over. But then something changed. The girl began to play a melody. It was soft and uneven at first, but it carried something honest. She wasn't just pressing keys. She was creating something with her heart. She found harmony where there should have been noise. She made broken notes sound alive. Every tone, every pause seemed to come from deep inside her. The crowd, expecting a mistake or a childish tune, slowly grew quiet again. Even the laughter stopped. The melody floated through the room, tender and sad. The piano might have been old, but the feeling behind it was real. The millionaire stared at her, not sure why he couldn't look away. Her small face showed no pride, no fear, just calm focus. Her lips moved slightly, as if she were whispering to the music itself. There was a strange power in that. When she reached the middle of the song, one of the keys stuck and refused to play. For a second, everyone thought she would stop. But she didn't. She simply changed her rhythm, filling the silence with softer notes, adapting as if she had rehearsed this broken melody 100 times before. Her fingers danced faster now, flowing with confidence. The music rose gently, then fell again like a wave, Some people had tears in their eyes and didn't even realize it. The sound wasn't perfect, but it was full of emotion, like someone telling a story through sound instead of words. The millionaire shifted in his seat. Something stirred in him, something uncomfortable and unfamiliar. For years he had surrounded himself with people who only said what he wanted to hear. But this little girl with her plain dress and her broken piano was saying something he couldn't ignore. When the last note came, it lingered longer than it should have. The girl lifted her hands from the keys and looked down as if she didn't want to face the room. The silence that followed felt heavy, but not empty. Then a soft clap came from somewhere in the back. It was hesitant at first, then more joined in. Soon the hall was filled with applause, not the loud kind meant for show, but the gentle, respectful kind that comes from genuine feeling. The millionaire didn't clap. He just sat there, his face unreadable. The girl turned slightly and smiled shyly, unsure if she had done well. She whispered almost to herself, "I'm sorry. The piano is broken." Those words hit him harder than he expected. Something about her voice, pure, honest, without any complaint, brought back a memory he hadn't thought about in years. He remembered another piano, a grand one, in a bright room filled with sunlight, and someone else playing, someone who used to smile at him when he entered the room after work, someone who believed that music could make a heart softer. He hadn't listened then. He had been too busy. That person was gone now, and with her had gone the warmth in his life. The director walked up and gently thanked the girl. The audience began to talk again, softly at first, still caught in the moment. The millionaire rose from his chair slowly. People turned to see what he would do. Would he laugh again? Would he walk away? But he didn't say anything. He just looked at the girl for a long moment. She looked back at him, her eyes clear and curious. Maybe she still believed he would keep his promise, maybe not. But there was no fear in her gaze, only quiet hope. He cleared his throat and turned toward the director. "That was unexpected," he said quietly. Then he walked out of the hall without another word. The girl stayed by the piano, her small fingers tracing the keys. She didn't seem sad. She didn't even notice that he had gone. She just smiled softly as if the piano had spoken back to her. Outside, the night air was cold. The millionaire stood by his car for a long time before getting in. Inside the vehicle, surrounded by silence, he could still hear that melody in his head. Soft, fragile, but full of life. It refused to fade. He thought about her words again. "I'm sorry. The piano is broken." No, he thought to himself, the piano wasn't the only thing broken. Something inside him was too. He didn't know it yet, but that single moment, that small performance from a girl who had nothing but a dream, had already started to change him. The morning after the charity event, the orphanage was filled with quiet excitement. The children couldn't stop talking about what had happened the night before. Some of them tried to hum the tune the little girl had played, though none of them could capture it the same way. To them, it wasn't just a melody. It was a moment they would never forget. The girl herself woke early, long before the sun had fully risen. She didn't sleep much that night. Her mind kept replaying the sound of the piano, the faces in the crowd, and the man's expression when she finished playing. She didn't really understand what had happened. She only knew that she had played with all her heart, and something about that moment felt special, like the world had listened for the first time. She walked to the hall, still in her nightdress, and sat on the same stool by the piano. The air was cool and sunlight was just beginning to touch the keys through the tall windows. She ran her small hand across them. Some keys were cold, others chipped or loose, but to her they were beautiful. The piano had been there long before she arrived at the orphanage. Some of the older children said it had been donated by a music school decades ago. Others said a kind lady used to visit and play it for the children every Sunday. But one day she stopped coming and no one knew why. The girl didn't know if those stories were true. She just knew that the piano was her best friend. Every time she felt lonely or scared, she would sit and play. Sometimes no sound came out, but she didn't care. It was enough to feel the keys under her fingers. To her, music wasn't about being perfect. It was about speaking a language her heart understood. That morning, as she played softly to herself, one of the older caretakers walked in. She smiled gently and said, "You're up early again. Still thinking about last night?" The girl nodded. "Do you think he was angry?" The caretaker tilted her head. "The man from last night?" Yes, the one who said he would adopt me if I played. The woman paused, unsure how to answer. She didn't want to break the child's hope, but she also knew that people like that man often said things they didn't mean. I don't think he was angry, she said finally. Maybe he just didn't expect what he heard. The girl looked down at the keys and smiled faintly. He looked sad. The caretaker blinked, surprised. Sad? Yes, the girl said softly. When I was playing, he looked like he remembered something. Maybe a song. The caretaker didn't know what to say to that. She only patted the girl's shoulder and told her to come eat breakfast. But even as she walked away, she kept thinking about what the child had said. Later that day, when the children went outside to play, the orphanage director received a phone call. It was from one of the guests who had attended the charity event. She spoke with excitement, saying that the performance had left everyone talking, especially about the little girl and her old piano. But the most surprising thing, she said, was that the millionaire had not left the city yet. He was still staying in his hotel, and some people said he had been asking questions about the orphanage. The director felt a mix of curiosity and nervousness. People like him didn't usually show interest twice. He had laughed at the event, made a joke, and left. That was the end of it usually. But if he truly wanted to know more, maybe there was something behind that moment that touched him deeper than he admitted. By afternoon, a black car pulled up in front of the orphanage gates. The children noticed first and ran to the windows. The director straightened her clothes quickly and hurried downstairs. The millionaire stepped out, dressed sharply as always, but his face was different. Softer somehow, quieter. He greeted the director politely and asked to look around. The staff led him through the halls, showing him the dormitories, the kitchen, the classrooms. He listened carefully this time, nodding as they spoke. It was clear he wasn't here just for show. When they reached the main hall, his eyes went straight to the piano. He walked closer and placed his hand on the wooden edge. The paint was peeling off and there were scratches everywhere. Dust had settled into the cracks. He pressed one key. It made no sound. Another made a dull note. He sighed quietly. Is this the same one from last night? He asked. Yes, the director said. It's been here for years. The children love it even though it's almost unplayable. He nodded slowly. And the little girl. Is she here? She is, the director replied carefully. She's outside playing with the others. For a long moment he didn't speak. He kept looking at the piano like it reminded him of something he didn't want to forget. Then he said quietly, Please ask her to come in. The director nodded and sent someone to fetch the girl. A few minutes later, she appeared at the door, shyly holding her hands together. Her eyes widened when she saw the man standing near the piano. She hadn't expected to see him again. He smiled faintly. Do you still remember me? She nodded. You said if I played the piano you would adopt me. The room went silent. The director looked nervous, but the man only smiled again, not with arrogance this time, but with something like regret. Yes, he said softly. I did say that. He turned to the piano once more. You played beautifully. I didn't expect it. That melody. His voice trailed off. For a moment he seemed lost in thought. Then he looked at her again. Tell me, how did you learn to play like that? The girl shrugged gently. No one taught me. I just listen. Sometimes the piano sounds sad, so I try to make it happy. Her words caught him off guard. He stared at her, unsure how a child could say something that simple yet so profound. He sat on the nearby bench and gestured for her to play again. She looked to the director for permission, who nodded. So she sat down and began to play, the same melody from the night before. But this time there was no crowd, no laughter, no noise. Just the two of them and the sound of broken keys trying their best to sing. The man closed his eyes and let the music wash over him. It reminded him of his late wife, her hands on the piano, her laughter echoing through their old house. She used to say music could heal anything if you let it. He never believed her back then, but now sitting in that orphanage hall he wasn't so sure. When the girl finished, she looked up at him. Did you like it? He nodded slowly. Yes, very much. She smiled, a small, pure smile that made the room feel warmer. He looked at the director. This piano deserves to be fixed, he said firmly. I'll arrange for someone to restore it. No child should have to play music on something that's falling apart. The director's eyes widened in surprise. That's very generous of you, sir. The children will be thrilled. He stood up and took one last look at the girl. You have a gift, he said softly. Don't stop playing no matter what, she nodded. I won't. That night after he left, the director found the girl sitting by the piano again. She asked her gently, Do you know why he came back? The girl thought for a moment. Maybe the piano called him, she said with a little smile. The director laughed softly. Maybe it did. Days later, workers arrived at the orphanage carrying tools and equipment. The children gathered around, amazed as they saw the piano being lifted carefully and placed into a truck. The man had kept his promise. He sent it to be restored by experts, and he also donated money to repair the hall. For the first time, the old building felt alive again. The children sang more often, and the girl looked forward to seeing her piano return. Every day she stood by the window, waiting. And miles away, the millionaire sat in his office staring at a photograph of a younger version of himself, standing beside a woman at a grand piano. He ran his fingers over the frame and whispered, You were right. Music does heal. For the first time in years, he smiled. He didn't realize it yet, but something inside him had already changed, and the little girl at the orphanage had been the reason. The piano returned to the orphanage 3 weeks later. When the truck pulled up at the gates, the children ran out, shouting with excitement. The girl stood at the front, her small hands clasped tightly together, eyes wide with wonder. The piano was covered in a thick protective cloth, but she could already tell it looked different, newer, brighter somehow. The workers carefully carried it into the main hall. When they finally removed the cover, everyone gasped. The old broken piano that had once looked dull and worn was now shining. The wood was polished, the keys were spotless, and even the brass pedals gleamed. It looked like a dream. The girl walked up slowly and touched one of the white keys. It felt smooth, warm under her fingers. She pressed it gently, and a perfect note filled the room. Her eyes lit up instantly. The sound was clear and strong, not like before. It was alive again. The orphanage director smiled. He kept his word, she said softly. That afternoon, the hall filled with laughter and music. The children gathered around as the girl played song after song. Some she made up on the spot, others she remembered from before. For the first time, her music filled the entire building without any broken notes or silence. It was as if the piano had been waiting all those years for her to bring it back to life. But far away in his large empty house, the millionaire sat by a window, listening to the faint sound of the city. His home was beautiful, filled with expensive art, tall glass windows and golden frames, but it felt empty. Ever since that day at the orphanage, something had been bothering him. The melody she played wouldn't leave his mind. It came back to him every night when the house was quiet. He had never been a man who thought much about feelings. He was used to making deals, signing papers, and moving on. But now he found himself sitting in silence for long hours, remembering that girl's calm face and the way she played as if the whole world disappeared around her. He didn't understand why it mattered so much. Maybe it was because she reminded him of his wife, how she used to play the piano in their living room. There was always a soft glow of evening light on her face when she played. She said music could speak when words couldn't. Back then, he had laughed at the idea. He thought love and music were just distractions from work. But now, years later, he sat alone in a quiet house, surrounded by everything money could buy, except peace. One evening, he found himself driving again to the orphanage without really planning to. The road seemed to take him there by itself. When he arrived, the gatekeeper looked surprised but quickly let him in. The sound of the piano was already echoing through the hall. He followed the music like it was calling him. When he entered, he saw her sitting there again, her small back straight, her fingers moving gracefully over the keys. She didn't see him at first. Her eyes were closed, lost in the melody. He stood quietly by the doorway, listening. The tune was simple but full of feeling, soft in some moments, strong in others. It was like she was telling a story without speaking a single word. He watched her carefully. Her shoulders moved gently with the rhythm, and her face showed every emotion her heart felt. When she finally stopped, she looked up and saw him standing there. Her eyes widened, then she smiled shyly. "You came back," he nodded. "I wanted to hear you play again." She gestured toward the piano. "It sounds so much better now." "Thank you for fixing it," he smiled faintly. You're the one who brought it back to life. I only paid the bill, she tilted her head. It's not just the piano that changed, she said softly. It feels like the air changed too. He raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? It feels lighter, she said, looking around. Before it was sad here. Now it feels happy. He didn't know what to say. There was truth in her words, even if he couldn't explain it. He sat down on the nearby chair, watching her hands as she played a new tune. After a few minutes, he asked quietly, Do you know what song that is? She shook her head. It's not really a song. It just comes to me. He leaned back, closing his eyes, letting the music fill his mind. For the first time in years, he felt peace. No business calls, no meetings, no pressure. Just music and the soft sound of the piano keys. When she finished, he asked gently, What do you dream about? She looked at him, surprised by the question. Dream? Yes, he said. What do you want to be when you grow up? She thought for a moment, then smiled. I want to play on a big stage one day. I want to make people feel the way I feel when I play. I want to make sad hearts smile again. Her answer made him look away for a second. That's a beautiful dream, he said softly. She hesitated before asking, What did you dream about when you were little? He froze. No one had asked him that in decades. He thought about it, trying to remember. I wanted to build things, he said finally. Big buildings. To see my name on them. Did you do it? She asked. Yes, he said with a small laugh. Many times. Then why do you look sad? The question hit him harder than he expected. He didn't answer. He just looked at her, and for a moment all his success felt small compared to her innocence. He stood up slowly and walked toward the piano. May I? He asked. She nodded and moved aside. He sat down and placed his hands on the keys. He hadn't touched a piano in years. The keys felt unfamiliar, almost strange. He pressed one, a soft note rang out. Then another. Soon he tried to play a simple tune he remembered from long ago, but his fingers stumbled. He chuckled awkwardly. It's harder than I remember, the girl giggled. You just have to listen. Don't think too much, he smiled. That's easy for you to say. She placed her small hands over his and guided them to the right notes. Like this, she whispered. Together they played a few slow notes that somehow turned into a little melody. It wasn't perfect, but it made them both laugh. For the first time in a long time, he laughed. Not the polite kind, but a real one. When the song ended, he looked at her and said quietly, You remind me of someone I used to know. Someone who loved music as much as you do. Was she your friend? The girl asked. She was more than that, he said softly. She was my wife. She used to play the piano just like you, every evening. But she's gone now. The girl looked down sadly. I'm sorry, he nodded, his eyes distant. She told me once that music keeps people alive even when they're not here anymore. I didn't believe her then. But now I think I do. They sat in silence for a while, both staring at the keys. Finally, the girl said quietly, Maybe she sent the music back to you, through me. He looked at her, and for a moment he didn't see just a little girl. He saw kindness, courage, and something that healed the quiet parts of his soul. That night as he drove home, the melody they played together stayed with him. He couldn't stop humming it. It felt like the house wasn't so empty anymore. For the first time, he didn't eat dinner alone in silence. He sat by his piano, the one covered in dust for years, and touched the keys gently. They still worked. The sound was different from the orphanage piano, but somehow the feeling was the same. He closed his eyes and played the tune she had taught him. Slowly, carefully, until it filled the room with warmth. The next day, he called the orphanage. Tell her, he said quietly to the director, that she played something I can't forget. The director smiled on the other end of the line. She's been playing all morning. I think she can't forget you either. He didn't reply right away. He just looked out the window at the sunlight spreading over the city and said softly, Maybe that's a good thing. And somewhere, across town, the girl was playing the same melody, her small hands dancing over the keys, unaware that every note she played was quietly changing another life. The days at the orphanage began to feel lighter after that. The piano had changed everything. The children spent more time in the hall singing together, clapping to rhythms and laughing as the little girl played one joyful tune after another. It became their favorite place, a small world of music in an old building that once felt quiet and tired. But for the girl, something deeper was happening. Every time she touched the keys, she thought of the man who had fixed the piano. She could still remember the way he had smiled when they played together, and how his eyes looked softer that day. She didn't know much about his world or the kind of life he lived, but she felt a strange connection to him, as if her music had reached a place in his heart no one else could. Meanwhile, in his grand house, the millionaire's life was slowly beginning to change in quiet ways. He still worked, still went to meetings, but his evenings were no longer empty. He started spending time in his old music room again. The piano, once covered in dust, now stood open every night. Sometimes he played the melody she had shown him. Other times he just listened to the echoes of the notes filling the silence. It was peaceful, something he hadn't felt in years. One evening he received a letter from the orphanage. It was written in neat handwriting and began with, "Dear Sir, the children wanted me to write to you." The letter went on to thank him for fixing the piano and helping them. But at the bottom, in smaller letters, there was another line. "Please visit again soon. We miss your smile." He stared at that one sentence for a long time. His smile? He hadn't even realized he'd smiled that day. But reading those words made something inside him warm. He set the letter on his desk and looked out the window. The city lights glowed far below, but for once he didn't feel proud of the buildings he owned or the deals he'd made. What he thought about was that small girl sitting at the piano, her face lit up with hope. The next weekend, without telling anyone, he drove to the orphanage again. It was early afternoon and the children were outside playing. When they saw the black car pull up, they shouted with excitement and ran toward the gate. The girl was among them, her eyes wide with surprise and joy. He stepped out, smiling as the children gathered around him. The orphanage director came out too, looking pleased but also curious. "You came back," she said warmly. "I thought I'd check how the piano sounds after being played every day," he replied with a light chuckle. They all laughed, and the girl quickly ran inside to the hall. He followed her. The sunlight was streaming through the high windows, touching the piano with a soft glow. She sat down, eager to show him something. "I made a new song," she said shyly. "Do you want to hear it?" He nodded. Of course, she began to play. The music started slow and quiet like a whisper, then grew stronger and brighter with every note. It was full of life and light, almost like laughter turned into sound. The children gathered behind her, clapping softly along. The melody rose higher, then fell again, delicate and full of heart. He watched her, completely lost in the moment. Her small hands moved quickly and gracefully. There was confidence in every note. But more than that, there was truth. Pure, simple, unguarded. It was the kind of honesty that couldn't be bought or taught. When the song ended, the room filled with applause. The children cheered, shouting her name. The millionaire joined in, clapping quietly but smiling proudly. Then the girl looked at him and said softly, "This song is for you." It's about someone who forgets how to smile but then remembers again. Her words struck him harder than she could have imagined. For a moment he couldn't speak. He looked down at the piano, blinking away a sudden sting in his eyes. He wasn't a man who cried easily. Years of building wealth and power had taught him to stay strong, to never show weakness. But now, standing there in that small hall filled with children's laughter, he felt something break open inside him. He turned slightly, hoping no one would notice the tears beginning to form. But the girl saw. She tilted her head, worried. "Did I play it wrong?" she asked gently. He quickly shook his head. "No," he said, his voice low and trembling. "You played it perfectly." He sat down on one of the benches, covering his face for a moment. The director, watching from the doorway, quietly guided the children outside so he could have a moment alone. The hall grew quiet, the air still carrying the echo of the last note. The girl remained by the piano, unsure if she should speak. After a long pause, he looked up again. His eyes were wet, but his face was peaceful. He smiled weakly. "You know," he said softly, "someone once played a song for me a long time ago. It sounded almost like that. She said it was a song about hope." "Was it your wife?" the girl asked quietly. He nodded slowly. "Yes, she used to fill my home with music. But when she passed away, I stopped listening. I stopped everything." He looked at the piano again. "When you played the first time, it felt like she was in the room again. That's why I couldn't say anything that day. It was too much." The girl's eyes softened. "Maybe she wanted you to hear it again." He smiled at her kindness. "Maybe she did." They sat there in silence for a while, the sound of the wind coming through the open window. Then he said quietly, "Do you know what I realized today? Money can buy everything except what you gave me that night. Peace." The girl didn't know what to say, but she smiled and whispered, "Music can find what's missing." He nodded slowly, looking at her like he was seeing something precious. "Yes," he said, "it really can." That afternoon he stayed longer than he had planned. He ate with the children, listened to their stories, and even laughed at their jokes. The caretakers were surprised to see a man so powerful sitting cross-legged on the floor, sharing simple food and laughing like a child. When it was time to leave, he stood by his car and turned back to the girl. "Keep playing," he said softly. "Don't stop no matter what happens. Your music changes people. It changed me." She smiled brightly. "Will you come again?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I think I will." When his car drove away, the children waved until it disappeared down the road. The girl stood there a little longer, holding on to the memory of that smile, the one that had once been hidden behind pride and loneliness, now shining with warmth. That night, the millionaire sat at his piano again. The same room that once felt like a museum now felt alive. He began to play the tune she had written for him, the one about remembering how to smile. It wasn't perfect. His fingers were still clumsy, but it was honest. Halfway through the song, he stopped and looked up at the photograph of his wife that hung on the wall. He whispered softly, "You were right. Music really does heal." And for the first time since she was gone, he felt her presence, not in sadness but in peace. From that day on, his visits to the orphanage became regular. He didn't come with gifts or speeches. He just sat quietly, listening to the music, talking with the children and finding pieces of his heart that he didn't know were still there. The girl didn't know it yet, but her life was about to change forever. Every note she played had drawn him closer, not just to her but to the idea of family again. And soon what began as a careless challenge would become something far deeper than anyone could have imagined. Because sometimes, one honest song is all it takes to awaken a heart that had been asleep for years. The days after his second visit passed slowly, but something had changed in both their lives. The millionaire couldn't stop thinking about the girl and her music. Her song played in his head even when he was in meetings or reading reports. It wasn't just the melody that stayed with him, but the feeling behind it, pure, honest, and filled with something he hadn't felt in years: warmth. He had lived a long time surrounded by wealth, but his world was built of silence. He had houses filled with paintings and sculptures, yet none of them could touch his heart the way that small girl's piano playing did. One evening, as he sat in his grand study, he thought back to what he had said that day long ago, that careless, proud sentence that started it all. "If she plays the piano, I'll adopt her." He had meant it as a joke, a show of arrogance, not as a promise. But now those words echoed in his mind like a call he couldn't ignore. He began to wonder if he truly could keep that promise. Could he bring her into his world, a world so different from hers? Would she even be happy in it? He wasn't sure, but the thought wouldn't leave him. A few days later, he drove to the orphanage again. This time he brought no gifts, only questions. When he arrived, the children ran out to greet him like before, and the girl came running too, her face lighting up when she saw him. "You came back," she said, her eyes shining. "I told you I would," he replied gently. "I had to hear another one of your songs." She giggled and took his hand, leading him to the piano hall. "I made something new." "It's a happy song this time," she said proudly. He smiled and nodded for her to play. The tune she played was light and full of joy, like sunshine dancing through the room. The children clapped and swayed, and even the caretakers smiled from the doorway. When she finished, the room burst into laughter and cheers. He clapped the loudest. "You've become even better," he said. The girl blushed. "I just play what I feel." He sat beside her at the piano, looking down at the keys. "Do you know what I feel when you play?" he asked softly. She looked up curiously. "What?" "Peace," he said after a pause. "Something I lost a long time ago." The girl tilted her head. "Then you should play more. That's how I find peace too." He smiled at her innocence. For a while they just sat there together, the piano between them, the sound of children's laughter floating from outside. Later that day, the director invited him to her office for tea. She thanked him for spending time with the children and told him how much his visits meant. Then as their conversation grew quiet, he asked the question that had been sitting heavy on his heart. What would it take, he began slowly, for someone like me to adopt a child from here? The director looked up surprised. You mean her? She asked softly. He nodded. Yes, but I don't want to do it out of pity or guilt. I want to do it because she deserves a better life, and because she's given me back something I thought I'd lost forever. The director smiled kindly but said carefully, It's not a simple process. There are many steps. And you should be sure, a child isn't just someone you care for temporarily. It's a lifetime. He nodded. I understand. Have you spoken to her about it? The director asked. He shook his head. Not yet. I don't want to confuse her or make promises I can't keep. The director leaned forward. She looks up to you. She talks about you every day. If you do this, it will mean everything to her. But please be certain, she's already lost enough in her young life. He listened quietly, feeling the weight of her words. That night he couldn't sleep. He sat by the window of his big, empty house thinking about the girl, her laughter and the way her music had filled his heart. He thought about the promise he had once made carelessly, and how life had turned it into something real. The next morning, he made his decision. When he returned to the orphanage a few days later, he found the girl sitting alone by the piano. She was playing softly, lost in thought. He walked in quietly and sat down beside her. You always find your way to the piano, he said gently. She smiled. It makes me feel close to the people I miss. He looked at her carefully. Who do you miss? My mother, she said softly. I don't remember her much, but when I play, I feel like she can hear me. Sometimes I close my eyes and imagine she's listening. He nodded, his chest tightening. You know, he said after a pause, sometimes people come into our lives and remind us that love doesn't end. It just changes shape. She looked at him curiously. What do you mean? He smiled faintly. I mean that maybe we find family in unexpected ways. She thought about that, her small hands resting on the keys. Do you think people like us can have families again? She asked quietly. He hesitated for a moment, then reached out and gently placed his hand over hers. Yes, he said softly. I think we can. She looked up at him with wide, hopeful eyes. Really? He nodded slowly. But only if both hearts are ready. For a long time, they just sat there in silence. Then with a small, nervous voice, she said, I would like that. To have a family again. His throat tightened. He smiled gently and whispered, so would I. From that day, he began the process. It wasn't easy. There were meetings, papers, background checks, and long interviews. But he didn't give up. Every time he felt tired or unsure, he remembered her music and the way her eyes lit up when she played. That gave him strength. Weeks passed. The orphanage buzzed with whispers. The children knew something special was happening, though no one said it aloud. The girl herself didn't know the details. She only knew that he visited more often, bringing her small books about music and sometimes sitting beside her, helping her learn new songs. One day she asked him shyly, if you could have any song written just for you, what would it sound like? He thought for a moment and smiled. It would sound like hope, he said softly. The kind that starts small but grows stronger with every note. She grinned. Then I'll write you one, and she did. For days she worked on the tune, scribbling notes on paper, humming softly to herself. When she finally played it for him, it was simple but beautiful, full of warmth, promise, and light. When she finished, he couldn't speak. He simply stood there, walked over, and placed his hand gently on her shoulder. That's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me, he said quietly. She smiled proudly. Then it's yours forever. As time went on, he became more than a visitor. He became part of their little world. The children began calling him uncle, and the girl grew more attached to him each day. She would wait eagerly by the window whenever he was supposed to visit, and the other kids would tease her, saying, Your rich friend is coming again. She would laugh but never deny it. Then one morning, something incredible happened. The director called her into the office where he was waiting. She looked up at him, confused but happy to see him. The director smiled and said softly, We have good news. You're going home, the girl blinked in surprise. Home? He nodded, his voice full of emotion. With me, if you still want to. Her hands trembled as she looked at him, her eyes wide. "You mean, you really want me to live with you?" He smiled, tears glimmering in his eyes. "Yes, not because I have to, because I want to." For a moment she stood frozen. Then she ran forward and hugged him tightly. It was the first time she had ever hugged him, and he felt her small arms around him, full of trust and love. He closed his eyes, holding her gently. "Welcome home," he whispered. The other children clapped and cheered, and even the caretakers wiped tears from their eyes. The orphanage had seen many goodbyes, but this one was special. It wasn't just a story of kindness, but of two hearts that had found each other when they both needed it most. That evening, as they left together, the girl looked back one last time at the old building, smiling through her tears. "I'll come visit," she promised. The millionaire nodded, placing his arm around her shoulders. "We both will," he said. As their car drove away, the sun dipped behind the clouds, casting a warm, golden glow across the road. For the first time in years, he felt something that no amount of money had ever given him: joy. And beside him, the girl looked out the window, humming softly the tune she had written for him, the song of hope that had changed both of their lives forever. The first night in her new home felt like a dream. The girl could hardly believe she was really there, in a house so big it almost felt endless, with soft lights, clean walls, and a room that was truly hers. For the first time in her life, she had a bed that wasn't shared, a window that opened to a garden, and shelves where her few belongings looked small but special. She stood in the middle of her new room, holding a small music notebook against her chest. The man, the millionaire who was now her guardian, watched from the doorway. He smiled gently, trying not to startle her. "Do you like it?" he asked softly. She turned, her eyes shining. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It feels like it's waiting for me," he chuckled quietly. "That's because it is. It's yours now." She looked around again, still in disbelief. "I've never had a place that was just mine." "Well," he said, walking into the room, "this is your space. You can fill it with music, drawings, or anything that makes you happy. This is your home now." Her lips trembled a little as she smiled. "Home," she repeated softly, as if testing the word for the first time. That night, when the house grew quiet, she sat at the piano downstairs, the grand instrument that once belonged to his late wife. She touched the keys carefully, almost afraid to make a sound. But when she pressed the first note, it felt like the house itself came alive. The melody she played was gentle and slow, a song of gratitude and new beginnings. Upstairs, he sat by his window, listening. He didn't go down. He just closed his eyes and let her music fill the silence. It was soft and tender, wrapping around him like a warm memory. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. In the days that followed, life began to settle into a quiet rhythm. He would leave for work in the morning, but before stepping out, he would always stop by the piano room to listen to her play. Sometimes she would wave goodbye from the staircase, smiling brightly. When he returned in the evening, the sound of the piano would greet him before he even entered the hall. She was always waiting, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. On weekends, they explored the city together. He took her to music stores where she would press her nose against the glass, staring at instruments with wonder. He would laugh and tell her, "Pick one," but she always shook her head shyly. "I already have a piano," she would say. "It's enough." He began to notice how simple her joys were: a walk in the park, an ice cream cone, a stray cat she wanted to feed. It reminded him of something he had forgotten. Happiness didn't come from having more. It came from feeling alive. One afternoon, he took her to a music academy. The director, a kind woman with bright eyes, listened as the girl played a short piece. When she finished, the woman was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled. "She doesn't just play notes," the director said softly. "She plays stories." He looked at the girl proudly. "That's what I've been trying to tell people," he said. The director nodded. "If you'd like, we can train her here. She has a gift. With a bit of guidance, she could become someone truly remarkable." He glanced at the girl. "What do you think?" Her eyes widened. "Can I really?" "Only if you want to," he said gently. "I do," she said, beaming. "I want to learn everything about music." And so she began lessons at the academy. Every morning he dropped her off before work, and every evening she came home eager to show him what she'd learned. She started reading sheet music, composing small tunes and performing for small gatherings at the school. Each time she played, people would stop to listen, not just because of her skill, but because of the emotion she carried in every note. Months passed, and their bond grew stronger. She started calling him father naturally one day at breakfast without even realizing it. The word slipped out softly when she said, "Father, can you come to my recital next week?" He froze for a moment, his spoon halfway to his mouth. Then slowly a smile spread across his face. "Of course," he said. "I wouldn't miss it for anything." That night when he went to his study, he sat quietly for a long time, staring at a framed photograph of his late wife. "She called me father," he whispered, a tear sliding down his cheek. "I think you'd have liked her." The recital came sooner than he expected. The hall was small but full, and when she walked onto the stage in her simple white dress, the audience went silent. She sat at the piano, took a deep breath, and began to play. The song she chose wasn't one from her lessons. It was one she had written herself. The same melody she used to play at the orphanage, the one that had first touched his heart. But now it sounded fuller, more mature, as if life had added new colors to it. As she played, he felt his chest tighten with pride. Each note carried pieces of their journey, the laughter, the tears, the quiet evenings by the piano. It was their story told through music. When the final note faded, the audience erupted into applause. She looked out into the crowd, her eyes finding him instantly. He stood clapping with tears in his eyes. She smiled brightly, her face glowing under the lights. After the recital, she ran to him backstage. "Did I do okay?" she asked breathlessly. He knelt down, resting his hands on her shoulders. "You didn't just play okay," he said softly. "You played beautifully. You played from your heart. And that's what truly matters." She threw her arms around him and he held her close. Around them, teachers and students smiled, watching the scene with warmth. It was clear to everyone that they were more than just guardian and child. They were family. From that day, her name began to appear in small local papers. People started talking about the young pianist with a story that touched hearts. Some called her the girl who made a millionaire believe again. But for her, it was never about fame. It was about love, the kind she had found in the most unexpected place. Years passed. The house that once echoed with silence was now filled with laughter, music, and life. She grew taller, her music deeper, her heart even kinder. And though her talent took her to grand stages and big cities, she never forgot where it all began. The broken piano in that old orphanage. And the man who once said, "If she plays, I'll adopt her." One morning, long after her first recital, she returned to that same orphanage, and now repaired and brighter than ever. The children there gathered around her, curious and excited. She smiled at them, sat down at the piano, and began to play. The same old melody, but with new strength. When she finished, one of the small boys asked, "How did you learn to play like that?" She smiled and said softly, "Someone once believed in me when I had nothing. I just kept playing for him." Outside, her father stood by the gate, watching through the window. His hair had grown grayer, but his eyes still carried that same light from the day he first heard her play. When she came out, he asked, "Still making hearts stop with your piano?" She laughed. "Trying to." They walked together down the path, the sound of children's laughter following them. The air was filled with warmth, and as they reached the car, she looked up at him and said, "Thank you for everything." He smiled gently. "No," he said, "thank you. You gave me back my life." That evening, as the sun set, she sat once again at the piano in their home. Her father stood behind her, resting a hand on her shoulder. She began to play a new song, one that was soft, full of peace, and overflowing with love. It was a song that told the story of a man who had lost everything but found a daughter through the sound of music, and of a little girl who found a family through a piano. When the final note faded, she turned to him and said softly, "This one's for you." He smiled, eyes glistening. "I know," he whispered. "I can hear it." And as the night settled over their home, the melody lingered, gentle, timeless, and full of love. Because sometimes, a single act of kindness, a single song played from the heart, can change two lives forever.